If you search for Flutter provider, you should end up on this page here on pub.dev with the provider package. And there you find some documentation about how to use it, definitely interesting. But of course, that's now also what I will do together with you. We will start using it. And for that, you first of all have to install it, which you do by simply copying this entry here in the installing tab on the package page. Now go back to your project, and there in the pubspec.yaml file, add this entry below your Flutter dependency here, and make sure the indentation is correct because indentation matters. Once you save that file, Flutter should automatically go ahead and fetch these packages. If it doesn't do that, you can run flutter packages get in your terminal navigated into this project folder. With that, the provider package is installed, and of course the question is now, how do we use it? Now, a provider, in the end, needs to be defined with the help of a class, and you then build a new provider based on that class definition. Now, a provider, or this class you create, is also often referred to as a model, because you also kind of model your data there, the data in your app, which then changes. Now, I'm already using the term model here, though, and I'm using it here to define my data classes, my data types, which I have like a product here. And that is not really something I want to provide because a single product is just a single object I use. What I want to manage here with this state management solution is something bigger, a list of all my products, not just a single product. Now, therefore, I will create a new subfolder here and name it providers to set up my classes that define these bigger state management definitions, these bigger data definitions for my app, so to say, the data which also changes over time and which I want to reflect. So here in providers, I'll add a new file and name that products.dart. You can also name it products_provider if you want to make that differentiation really clear. Now, in the products.dart file, you define a new class, and I'll name that class products. However, now here, you don't just have a class like this. Instead, you need to add a mixin. I mentioned mixins earlier in the course already. You add mixins by adding the with keyword and then the name of the mixin. A mixin is a bit like extending another class. The core difference is that you simply merge some properties or some methods into your existing class, but you don't really turn your class into an instance of that inherited class. It's a bit like inheritance light, so to say. And the class we need to mix in here is the change notifier class, which is built into Flutter and which you enable by importing the Flutter Material Dart package here. Change notifier is basically kind of related to the inherited widget, which the provider package uses behind the scenes. An inherited widget, whilst we won't work with it directly, is simply a widget in Flutter which allows us to establish behind the scenes communication tunnels with the help of the context object, which we're getting in every widget. So this products class now mixes in the change notifier here, and you'll see why we add this mixin in a second. Now you can define whatever you want in this class, and here I want to define a list of products. So I'll first of all import my product model, only with one slash here. And I'll store a list of products here in the products class. So I'll have a list which will hold product data in the end, and I'll name this _items. You could also just name it items. I just want to make it really clear that this property here should never be directly accessible from outside. And I'll also show why I do this in a second. So I have my _items in there, and that's not a final list because it will change over time. And with that, I mean the value here in the items property, not just the items in the list, because as you learned, you can also change items in a list that is final, but here I really want to change the value that's stored in the property itself. Before we change anything, however, let's actually make sure we can fetch these items. And since I turned this into a private property by adding the underscore, which means it can't be accessed from outside, I'll add a getter here, which will return a list of products. And then it's a getter by adding the get keyword, which is named items without the underscore. And in there, I return my items, but not like this. Instead, I return a copy of them, which I do by wrapping items here into square brackets and then by using the spread operator. Now, why am I doing this? You have to remember that all these objects in Flutter and in Dart are reference types. If I would return my items list here, then I would return a pointer at this object in memory, right? That's what you learned earlier in the course. And that means that anywhere in the code where I get access to my products class here and where I then get access to the items, I get that address and therefore I get direct access to this list of items itself in memory. And hence I could start editing this list of items from anywhere else in the app where I tap into this products class. I don't want to do that. And I don't want to do that because when my products change, I actually have to call a certain method to tell all the listeners of this provider, remember the slide, you have the provider and you have listeners, that new data is available. So let's say we had an add product method here, which returns nothing, and which for the moment doesn't take an argument. And then here, we would simply add something to our items. Then, of course, we typically would have the problem that if we change data here in this class, how would we let all our widgets, or the widgets that are interested, know about this? And that's why we add this change notifier, because that gives us access to a notify listeners method. Because always keep in mind, this class will soon be used by the provider package, which uses inherited widget behind the scenes. And therefore, it will establish a communication channel between this class and widgets that are interested for us. And we need to let those widgets know about updates that we did with notify listeners, so that in these widgets, which are listening to this class and to changes in this class, are then rebuilt and do actually get the latest data we have in there. And that's why I return a copy, so that we can't directly edit our items here from anywhere else in the app, because if we would do that, we could not call notify listeners, because we can only do this from inside this class, because there we added this mix-in. And hence, our widgets that depend on the data in here would not rebuild correctly, because they wouldn't know about the change. So we have to make sure that we only change data from inside the class, because then we can trigger notify listeners, and all the other parts of the app that are listening to this class will then get rebuilt. Now, this might not be entirely clear yet because we're not listening yet, but that's the general idea here of why I do it like this. And for the moment, I'll comment this out, because for the moment, we don't really know how to add products. But that's the idea why we have change notifier and why we need this setup and why I return a copy here. But with that, let's start listening. And before we can start listening, we first of all need to provide this. Thus far, we have the class, but now we need to turn this class here into a data container, into a provider which we can use in our app and in the different parts of our app. And there, the products are important in a couple of places of this app, of course. They are important in the product detail and the products overview screen for the moment. That means that I want to provide this in the main Dart file, because that's important and that's something you have to know with the provider package. You need to provide a class which you then want to use from different widgets in your app at the highest possible point of all these widgets which will be interested. Which means that if the products overview and the product detail screen are interested in the data, I have to provide the class in a widget that is above them, which in my case is this my app widget, my root widget. If I had data which is only important to the product item widget, then I could provide that data in the products overview widget, because that is where I create the product item. No need to then manage it in the main Dart file. But here, since I have widgets which are registered on the root level, I need to also provide my data on the root level. By the way, that will not mean that the entire app will rebuild whenever something changes in the data though, but more on that in a second. So I want to provide my data here, and therefore let's import our provider, or this class we just worked on, from providers, and there from the products.dart file. And now we can set up a provider here. Now, how do we register a provider in our app then? To register a provider, you need to import something from that provider package, because there is a reason why we added it after all, right? So import provider Dart from the provider package. And now here in your My App widget, instead of returning material app, we'll actually wrap this into another widget. So wrap with new widget. And that new widget is now a provider. And there you got a couple of providers available. The most common provider, which I would recommend using, is the Change Notifier provider. And that's a class provided by that provider package which we installed. It allows us to register a class to which you can then listen in child widgets, and whenever that class updates, the widgets which are listening, and only these, not all child widgets, only child widgets which are listening, will rebuild. So here, you then have to provide a builder method. That builder method will receive a build context, and it should return a new instance of your provided class. So not a widget, a new instance of your provided class. So in our case, of the products class here. So here I simply return products like this. Now, one important note at this point though. The builder method here is the right method to choose if you are using version 3 of the provider package. So if you have, for example, this dependency in your pubspec.yaml file. If you are using the latest version, or specifically a version greater than or equal to 4, so if you, for example, have this entry in your pubspec.yaml file, then this will not work with builder. Instead, then it's create. And just like that, you simply have create instead of builder in that case. Now, I did record this course with version 3, which is why you will see builder in this video and the next videos, and you can absolutely use version 3 of the provider package. All you need to do is have this entry here in your pubspec.yaml file, for example. If you have this, you can just follow along with builder. But if you want to use the latest version, then you have to use create here. So if you have version 4 or higher, then you need create here. So don't be confused if you see something different in the next lectures. That's just because I used a different version. Now, one thing that does not change is how the provider package works, what it does, and so on. So that's all the same. Only this part here needs adjustment. Just wanted to point this out here. Now we set up a provider which provides an instance, and one and the same instance of this products class to all child widgets, so material app and all its children, which are interested. So all child widgets can now set up a listener to this instance of this class, to this same instance, this same object of this class. And whenever we change something in the class and we then call notify listeners, the widgets which are listening will be rebuilt. And that's really important. Only the widgets which are listening, not the whole material app. So just because something changes in here will not rebuild material app. It will only rebuild widgets which are listening. Now, where is a place where we could be interested? Well, the products overview there. Here in the products overview, I have my grid view builder. So I need my products here. Now, actually, you could even argue to not unnecessarily rebuild the app bar, which doesn't need any products data, that we outsource this grid view builder into a separate widget. So we can grab this, use the refactoring tool, and use extract widget here, and give this a name of products grid, maybe. Now we have that new widget which is created for us. And that should actually not receive the products as an argument, but get it itself by actually using our provider. Now, first of all, I'll move my products grid here into a new file. Technically, you don't need to do that, but I rather follow that convention. So my products grid.dart file. In there, of course, you need to import your material Dart file from Flutter and also import the product model because we're referring to it here. And that's important, the product model, so our normal model in the models folder, not the products file we just worked on, but the normal model here. I also need to reference product item in here because I'm using it. So let's import product item. In the products overview screen, we now don't need that product item import anymore. I also want to grab the dummy products we have in here and move them away out of that widget into the product start file in the providers folder, because there we have these products and I want to start with some dummy products for now. So that in the products overview screen, we don't need that anymore. We don't need the product model import anymore, therefore. We just need to import that new products grid from the widgets folder. So products grid dart. And we don't need the new keyword. So products grid is what I should import. And now products grid is created here in the products grid widget. Don't need that constructor or anything of that. I want to fetch all my data in here instead by setting up such a listener. And for that, in the build method, we can now use another feature from the provider package, and hence let's import package provider dart here. And that other feature is provider of context. Now we've seen that of context thing a couple of times throughout the course already, with the theme, with the navigator, and so on. I already explained there that this sets up a direct communication channel behind the scenes. And this here, the provider package, allows us to set up a connection to one of the provided classes, and therefore you can only use provider of in a widget which has some direct or indirect parent widget which set up a provider, which we did here. So that needs to be set up first, that provider. But then we can listen with provider of to changes in that provided class or in that provided object, to be precise. And this build method of this widget where I'm using provider of, and only this build method, and of course all the child widgets, will rebuild whenever the object I'm listening to changes. The build method of a parent widget of products grid, like the products overview here, will not rerun because we're not setting up a listener here. And that's of course important. Not the entire widget tree does rebuild if data changes, only the widget where I'm listening, and of course then, because this build method runs, all the child widgets are rebuilt too. That's the normal behavior. The question now is, how do we set up a connection between this widget and then this specific provider? Right now we only have one provider, but actually, as you will later also see, you can have more than one provider in your app. So I want to set up a listener to my provider, which actually provides me an instance of my products class. You tell Flutter or the provider package that you're interested in an instance of that products class by taking advantage of the fact that the of method here on the provider class provided by the provider package is a generic method, which means you can add these angle brackets to let it know to which type of data you actually want to listen to. So here I want to listen to changes in products. And now that's important. That now has to be products. So here we import from the providers folder and there from the product start file. With this piece of information, we're telling the provider package that we want to establish a direct communication channel to the provided instance of the products class. And now the provider package goes ahead and looks at the parent of products grid, the products overview screen. And there it finds no provider. So it goes ahead and has a look at the parent of the products overview screen. And that's of course our My App widget, because that's where I'm instantiating the products overview screen. And there, if it goes up the widget tree, it indeed finds a provider. And in that provider, thankfully, it finds a provider which thankfully provides an instance of type products. If we would create a different class here, then setting up this listener, of course, would fail. But since we do provide a new products object here, we can tap into it and listen to it here with provider of products context. So this here gives us access to this products object. So I'll name this products data. And that's not our list of products, but to the object based on this class. And this will then have a items getter because we added it here. So the products we actually work with are then simply fetched from products data by accessing items like this. And this now gives us a list of products And since type inference works here, we actually don't need the product model import because we don't need the product class itself here in the products grid. With that, we now get our products here, and we can now use the products here to determine the length and then forward that data to the product item. In the product item, as I explained earlier in this module, I'm fine with getting this data as an argument because this is data which this widget itself needs, which we don't just get to forward it, but which we want to output in that widget. And therefore, it's fine to accept it like this. It's actually recommended to get it like this because then it's very clear to see which configuration this widget needs to work correctly, and you can drop this widget anywhere into your app where you know you get this data, no matter if you have a provider above it or not. So with that was a lot of talking, but very important. Let's do a full restart now. And in our app, we now still see our items here, but now we're actually loading them with the help of our provided class. And the advantage, if not already evident, will become more and more clear the more complex our application gets.